First tonight, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has expressed optimism over the planned meeting between US and Ukrainian officials in Saudi Arabia. He said Washington needed to get a general idea of what concessions Kyiv is prepared to make so President Trump's plans for a quick truce in Ukraine can go ahead. All this, of course, happening less than a fortnight since President Zelensky was ejected from the White House after being told by Mr. Trump that he was disrespectful and ungrateful, and critically that suspension of military aid and intelligence sharing. So the stakes could not be higher for the Ukrainians. Meanwhile, Ukraine has targeted Moscow in the early hours of today in what appears to be one of the biggest drone attacks on the Russian capital since the conflict began. The governor of the Moscow region said at least 3 people had been killed and several more injured.
Понимаешь, да, что это война, все, но не осознаешь все равно так. А вот теперь, да, уже как бы она...
We understood there was a war, but we didn't properly realize it. But now it has come. Yes, we were weaving nets, collecting humanitarian aid, accompanying fighters, but we still didn't realize it. Now it has come.
По моему мнению, это только мое личное мнение, еще раз, она не последняя.
In my opinion, this attack won't be the last. Why? Because behind Ukraine's back are bloodthirsty and belligerent figures. I won't name them. This is Europe, first of all. They are still supplying them, Ukraine, quite well.
We woke up at 5 a.m. to a rumble. An explosion. We were afraid to turn on the lights. We ran out into the street. There were a lot of people, everyone came out with their pets, and people just had fear in their eyes. We don't understand what to do in such situations. The news says that more and more drones are being shot down. It's scary to even go to sleep after such a thing. Why can't they agree? Why not? What are they thinking about? It's terrible.
Well, for more on all that, I'm joined now on the line from London by the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. The first high-level face-to-face meeting between the US and Ukraine since President Zelensky was ejected from the White House, and the subsequent tumultuous events with the US cutting off military aid and intelligence sharing. So a crucial day for Ukraine.
It is a very, very important day for Ukraine. It is their opportunity to put forward their case to the USA and to give a case that might be sufficient to finish the war. However, it has to be pointed out that, as you said in your lead-in, it's the question of what concessions Ukraine is prepared to give is what the Americans are looking for. And so already, because in that spirit, the talks are going to be conducted, the implication is of a win for Russia simply in the terms in which all this has been framed. This is why I insist upon it should be called a compromise, although it won't be, and as a result, it now comes across as a win for Russia.
Now, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, has said that it'll be very difficult for Ukraine to force the Russians back to where they were in 2014. So the US is clearly talking about giving up some territory. Will that be acceptable to Ukraine? Because Ukraine is saying publicly, up till even this morning, that they intend to get back every inch of their territory, and that if an attempt is made to prevent them from achieving this, many more crises will erupt.
Precisely. And that is why it is unlikely that Ukraine will provide USA with any possibility of ending this war by means of accepting concessions. About all they can do is play with the words. Namely, that they would say that some of this territory has been temporarily occupied by the Russians and will be diplomatically resolved. That was one idea. However, the fact of the matter is that Ukraine and Russia have got absolute different versions of what it would take to end this war, and America is simply in this case, unlikely to move Ukraine by diplomatic means. So the only question is whether they can force Ukraine to agree to any terms at all by means of military aid cut-off, intelligence cut-off, pressurizing Ukraine and quite possibly other nations too. If that they can't do that, then as things stand, Ukraine have shown no sign that they will compromise, although, as I stated a moment ago, were they to offer some concessions, then indeed there would be a possibility of finishing the war.
Well, just looking at what might be possible in terms of compromise, do you think Ukraine may insist on not giving up its legal rights to the territory currently occupied by Russia, but may be willing to freeze the conflict along current lines to resume negotiations at a later date?
Yes, and this is what I was referring to when I said playing with words. If they were to say that there will be a truce and it remains Russian occupied territory, then that is to be recovered by diplomatic means. The problem is that Russia does not have to accept any of this. In fact, recently, just literally in the last day or two, Russia has been winning yet again in the Kursk region, and therefore it follows logically that the attempt by Ukraine to simply not agree to anything except for, if you like, words, a verbal play, is unlikely to succeed. However, something along those lines, probably as an initial peacekeeping effort, is about all that America will be able to take away from this conference.
It's interesting that Ukraine targeted Moscow in the early hours of this morning in one of the biggest drone attacks on the Russian capital since the conflict began. What's your reading of that?
There are three aspects to this. The first is Ukraine is in the buying drones and making drones in a very huge amounts, and therefore an attack like this, as indeed one of your interlocutors in the interview stated, certainly wouldn't be the last for the war to continue. Number two, much has been made of this attack, and unquestionably it highlights that Ukraine wants to fight on, which is presumably the point. However, the aspect of it being such a media, if you like, projection, hides the fact that the real change that's recently occurred has not been this attack, but Russia suddenly has attacked in the Kursk region and is threatening to recover all the territory lost. If this attack by Russia comes off, then a handful of drone attacks are absolutely in secondary importance compared to Russia recovering its own territory.
Well, let's assess things from the US point of view. President Trump has made it clear that he will prioritize American interests in foreign policy. In that regard, how does he see Ukraine and its war with Russia? Because all the focus seems to be on Ukraine.
Yes, he primarily, and has stated this incidentally, can work with Russia, but finds it difficult to work with Ukraine. From his point of view as a businessman, as he has stated quite openly, Ukraine is not in a position to dictate terms, and that is precisely what President Zelensky for the past 3 years has been doing. Moreover, President Donald Trump has watched from the sidelines, as we all have, for 3 years, whilst peace initiative past the peace initiative proposed by the Ukrainians was totally unrealistic. And therefore, from his point of view, him being a businessman liking definite results, this is just waffle as peace talks go, unless he can get something concrete. He is unlikely to get that. And therefore, the question is, what will be his next step if Ukraine does not offer anything at all, apart from, as we said, this verbal thing about Russian occupied territory being there for some time, for the duration of a truce or whatever?
Well, I mean, his strategy seems to be asymmetrical, which is not something that we would normally expect to see from a US president, whether it's throwing President Zelensky out of the White House or the suspension of military aid and intelligence sharing. And that strategy seems to be working, doesn't it? Because by stopping aid, I mean, there is now a momentum towards peace. There are negotiations that were almost unthinkable a few months ago, and Zelensky is at the negotiating table.
Technically, he's not at the negotiating table. He's simply in the same city because he's got a team negotiating for him. But that's a literal sense. But in your sense, which is a metaphorical, yes, he has been brought, as is Ukraine, to the negotiating table to, at the very least here, consider peace terms from America or Russia, which would be, as you say, unthinkable before. The problem is he has shown no indication, as the Ukrainians shown no indication, of being prepared actually to offer any concessions, as opposed to coming to the table. So the fact that coming to the table, yes, it is because of Donald Trump that we're this far, but whether he can make the final push is unclear. Please note one minor point, but it is very important. The lack of intelligence sharing is by far the more important of the two short-term actions he has made. The Kursk attack, which I referred to previously, was only possible because the Ukrainians are now fighting blind on Russian soil. And therefore, this is actually a harbinger of what could be far more disastrous for Ukraine if USA carries on its asymmetrical policy, as you rightly call it, of seeking for Ukraine to make concessions and therefore appeasing to that extent the Russians.
And arguably for the first time, we heard a senior US official saying that they do expect concessions from the Russians. I mean, they've mentioned it before, but they've never been any emphasis on it. What concessions do you think they'll be pushing the Russians to make?
I believe that what they have in mind is that Ukraine will cede some territory, but not all that is currently in Russian hands. That is how I read the situation. There is an immediate problem here. President Putin has claimed all the territory that he has occupied as part of Russia now, and in fact more besides. So quite what concessions they expect from the Russians is unclear. If it means a signature that the Russians promise not to attack Ukraine again, then I suggest they look at the footage of Neville Chamberlain, who had it in Adolf Hitler's own handwriting that it will be peace for our time. And so therefore those sort of concessions are quite useless. And it's unclear that President Putin is prepared to surrender any of the territory he regards as Russian, any more than the Ukrainian president is prepared to surrender any territory which he states is Ukrainian. And so therefore, from this point of view, what the USA can achieve is open to question. The most interesting aspect is that Donald Trump has still not stated what he imagines or what he proposes this peace treaty to be. So to that extent, we still have in the dark as to what he has in mind.
I agree absolutely with your analysis there. And based on that, I mean, can we now infer, because I mean, we've seen, as you talked about, the asymmetric moves from America, we've talked about arm twisting. Can we now infer from what America is doing with Ukraine that there will no longer be unconditional US support for its allies, including Ukraine, but beyond Ukraine, despite decades of commitment and promises?
Yes. There is no question whatsoever that Donald Trump, as he states, it's America first, or he could even argue America only. This is nothing new in American policy. Isolation has been its dominant trait for decades, literally, though not recently. So it's rather the recent, if you like, 50, 60 years, which have been so different, and not, in fact, the policies he's now proposing. There's another aspect to this. America certainly did not immediately come to anybody's aid, either in World War I or in World War II. And please, it should be noted that there was a movement that America should be on Germany's side in World War I and World War II, which should not be simply dismissed out of hand. And the same thing goes now, that in the sense that Donald Trump is prepared to lend an ear to Russia, that's no different to America in the previous two world wars vis-a-vis Germany. So what I'm stating is, what you have said is, he will not automatically come to Europe's aid. That is quite clear. He will not automatically come to Ukraine's aid. That is quite clear. He is intent on looking to America's interest and may well work with Russia more than to date. And it is important to note that you cannot even state that America necessarily will share its intelligence and share anything with Europe. About the only country in a different situation in Europe is Great Britain, where because of Sir Keir Starmer's adroit diplomacy, it's, so to speak, off the American radar as a potential enemy or a potential person not to support. That much is clear. But as for the rest of Europe, certainly there is no doubt whatsoever that America, it's America first and will not come to anybody's help, even if they are attacked. Because please note, Russia was the aggressor and America simply isn't interested in that aspect.
Well, thank you very much indeed. You always hit the right notes and we appreciate the education. Thank you very much indeed. That's the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz, talking to me on the line there from London.